Hi, I'm Shagnik. In this video, I'm going to break down key concept 5.3 into bite-sized chunks to aid your understanding of AP United States History Period 5 with emphasis on the period of Reconstruction. The Union victory in the Civil War and the divided Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession, but left many questions unresolved about the power of the federal government and the citizenship rights. We have structured this video like the chapter in the text, so you might want to follow along with your books. In the first part of the video, we will be looking at the federal Reconstruction policy. In the second part, we will look at the short and long-term consequences of the Reconstruction process. In the final section of the video, we look at the events that led to a segregated South. Section 1. Federal Reconstruction Policy. The Emancipation Proclamation effectively turned the Union Army into an army of liberation for slaves. The proclamation led to many slaves defying their masters and fleeing their homes for enlisting in the Union Army that promised to free them after the Civil War was over. The Reconstruction era was marked by blacks becoming literate, enfranchised, at least partially, and holding offices that were previously exclusive for whites. Following the Civil War, the Republican Party developed two schools of thought. The moderate Republicans, who advocated emancipation only without voting rights or land grants, and the radical Republicans, who advocated not only the emancipation of slaves, but also advocated granting the former slaves the same rights as whites. The other big question was the process of readmission of the Confederate States into the U.S. The moderate Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln, argued that the southern states had never left, and thus they could conduct elections and resume statehood. But the radical Republicans argued that the 4 years of fighting effectively counted as secession. They argued that the states should be organized as territories and slavery should be purged in them before being readmitted as states. Lincoln also established the Federal Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, aka the Freedmen's Bureau. He also trusted the new Louisiana government, which ratified the 13th Amendment and set up a public school system. However, Louisiana's decision to not give blacks enfranchisement urged the radicals in Congress to not count Louisiana votes in the 1864 elections, as well as seating of the state's new senators. On April 15, 1865, the day when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became the president. He was Lincoln's vice president. Radicals in Congress urged him to pursue racial equality in the South and not the mere abolition of slavery. On May 29, 1865, President Johnson announced his plans for Reconstruction. The plan stated that states needed to support the 13th Amendment for readmission into the Union, but it denied to grant former slaves voting rights. He also declared pardon and full amnesty for former rebels if they pledged to support the Union and the end of slavery. The radical Republicans, as always, were not satisfied, but the Southerners, who were effectively allowed to form a white government, were very happy. Once elected, the Southern leaders passed laws severely limiting black freedoms. These came to be known as the Black Codes. Mississippi was the first state to enact such a law in November of 1865. One such example of these Black Codes was the Texas Act to define and declare the rights of former slaves and free persons of color. Passed in 1866 by the legislature of Texas, it banned interracial marriage and attempted to restrict the enfranchisement of free blacks. Other provisions of the code included not allowing blacks to hold public office and not allowing blacks to testify in court against whites. For many blacks, life did not change much after the Civil War, as they continued to be oppressed by the same policies that had terrorized them in the earlier periods. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens led the radical Republicans in the Senate and the House respectively. They thought that President Johnson was siding with the Southern slaveholders instead of the slaves, violating the Republican ideal of free labor by free men. The Congress undermined presidential reconstruction by the congressional delegates from the former Confederate states. They also created a joint committee on Reconstruction headed by moderate Senator William Pitt Fessenden and excluded most radicals. Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull proposed two pieces of legislation in 1866. The first was to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau to 1870. The second one was the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which defined all persons born in the US as citizens. Both of these bills were passed by Congress easily, but were vetoed by Johnson, but the Congress passed both bills with a two-third majority. In 1866, Congress set out and got agreement to put the civil rights law into the Constitution itself. But most states did not want to grant voting rights to immigrants, blacks, and women. Thus emerged the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to blacks and undid the 3/5 Clause and other parts of the Constitution. It also indirectly encouraged black male suffrage and declared Confederate debts null and void. Passed in Congress in June 1866, the amendment was ratified in July 1868, as it was popular in the North, and Southern states wanted to return to Congress. In January 1867, Congress passed a law granting suffrage to all black males in the District of Columbia. Then they passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the southern states into 5 military districts, where the military was to oversee the writing of constitutions, granting universal male suffrage. Only after these new constitutions were in place and the states ratified the 14th Amendment would their representatives be admitted into Congress. The creation of military districts in the South gave Johnson a lot of power as commander-in-chief, and he still controlled the Freedmen's Bureau. Many considered removing Johnson in early 1867, but Congress passed a number of laws that they hoped would continue Reconstruction in spite of the president. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, stating that anyone who required the Senate's consent to be appointed could be replaced when the Senate approved of a worthy successor. The purpose of this act was to ensure that Secretary of War Stanton remained in office. In February 1868, Johnson, in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, fired Stanton, challenging congressional authority. Congress was angered and thus made a vote to impeach Johnson. Johnson survived by one vote and was able to serve out the rest of his term in relative peace. The election in the fall of 1868 approached, and Ulysses S. Grant was nominated by the Republicans, with Schuyler Colfax as his running mate. The Democrats nominated Governor Horatio Seymour with Francis Blair as vice president. The main divide between the parties was not in economic policy, but rather on the issue of race. Grant won over 73% of the electoral vote for an easy victory. In February 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment in regards to giving all citizens the right to vote. However, the amendment lacked certain wording that may have seemed very necessary to the citizens. Many women were disappointed with the 15th Amendment because of its lack to address women's rights. Starting around 1869, famous Frederick Douglass argued that black men should be guaranteed the same rights as white men, and women of all races should have the right to vote. As late as 1868, free blacks could vote in only 8 northern states. However, in 1870, by law, black men had the right to vote everywhere in the United States. Many people considered the 15th Amendment a completion of the abolition movement and celebrated in joy. Others could at least see this event as a beacon of hope. Section 2. Impacts of Reconstruction. After the Civil War, voting increased in the South for blacks. In 1870, Hiram R. Revels was the first black man in the Senate. Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky challenges the right of Revels to be in the Senate, but he was alone in his protest since the majority saw it fitting for a black man to replace Jefferson Davis. In 1874, Blanche Bruce served on the Mississippi Senate. In total, 22 blacks served in Congress during the Reconstruction period. Schools for blacks were built during the Reconstruction period. Being forbidden to learn to read and write caused blacks to see schoolhouses as a symbol of freedom. During the 1870s, Northern immigrants, such as Confederate Army veterans, were teachers for former slaves. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 also provided support for public school education. From 1864 to 1865, Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15 provided 40-acre parcels of land for black families as well as mules. When President Johnson was made aware of the actions, he ended the 40-acre and mule policy and issued pardons to former plantation owners and returned the land to them. Aside from this, some slaves managed to purchase or win government land. One example was South Carolina, which provided land for 14,000 families. Land issues weren't the only concern for free blacks. The primary employment for slaves was to return to plantations where they were slaves as paid employment. Naturally, slaves wanted to avoid that, so they took work from the railroad industry and other industries. Unfortunately, it was illegal to be without a job during Johnson's Reconstruction, and it was difficult to find a job as a free black because some plantation owners only took back their own former slaves. These blacks were eventually deemed the name wage slaves. Wage slaves wanted land and a share in profit but only received very low wages. All this economic difficulty results in sharecropping. Sharecropping is when landowners give laborers a house, farm animals, tools, and credit in exchange for a share in the laborer's crop. Owners develop a credit system and plantation stores that keep the blacks in poverty and eternal debt through generations. Section 3. Southern Radicalism and the End of Reconstruction. As Reconstruction progressed in the South with the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, strong opposition from white Southern Democrats started to appear. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866, originally as a Confederate veterans group, but soon took to terrorizing blacks and Republicans. Other groups, such as the Knights of White Camellia, also rose to intimidate using violence. This 1868 political cartoon in Harper's Weekly shows this tension. Violence against blacks and Republicans was commonplace during the time period. The 1873 Colfax Massacre is one such example of this brutality. Democratic Sheriff Chris Columbus led 300 men against the black Republican Sheriff William Ward. Over 60 black people were killed in the massacre. The federal government worked to fight against this tide of violence. With the passage of the Enforcement Act of 1870, two other enforcement acts, and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, governmental power expanded to deal with the issues of Reconstruction. By 1872, the first Ku Klux Klan was eliminated, but vigilante violence was still commonplace against black people, and crimes were frequently unpunished. Reconstruction began winding down over the course of the 1870s due to a variety of factors. Firstly, corruption in the Grant administration and in Republican military governments. Reconstruction began winding down over the course of the 1870s due to a variety of factors, including corruption in the Grant administration and in Republican military governments. Publius Pinchback of Louisiana was the only black Reconstruction governor admitted to personally enriching his own wealth. Plots such as the Whiskey Ring served to lower popularity for Reconstruction. The Supreme Court in Slaughterhouse Case and Cruikshank versus the United States weakened the 14th Amendment and defended Southern Democrats from legal consequences. Republican interest in Reconstruction was also fading. With the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes was pitted against Samuel Tilden, where the former won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. An election commission ruled 8-7 in favor of Hayes in exchange for the end of Reconstruction. With this, the last federal troops left the South in 1877. Republican government in the South didn't disappear immediately, and some even continued into the 1890s. But the trend was for greater segregation and restrictions on black rights. Thus, the era of Jim Crow begins.